so upset because I had to just like I had it like oh like where it could separate from the spine, and he was so upset. And then I blamed it on my son. No, I'm not really the rest of my hands are
Hold up then.
I won't. California, I'll have to. Well, I guess they. Yeah, so I guess it's like, oh my god, yeah, it's brain. So I understand like a brain. I had no, and maybe she, maybe the best off. Yeah. But it's great.
All right.
Like a sweet amount of.
I can't believe it's January. But it's been like the longest no. I was just looking ahead and I'm like, oh, we're almost in February, but I feel like it's like the 75th of January or something. It feels like it's been a long month. Everyone doing okay? Hanging in there? Freezing?
Yeah.
That's cold out there, right? With like frost on everything this morning. It was kind of exciting, right? I wish it would. My brother lives in Massachusetts and he sent me a picture of all this snow. I was like, can we trade for one day? Just one day would be so much fun playing in the snow. Or maybe. All right, I had another thought. It left me. All right, so we're gonna jump back in. We'll get back to where we were. We left off here, right? So we didn't get too far into chapter 2, but we got through the biological model, right? Genetics, physical influences, neurotransmitters. We got through the beginning of this, right? We introduced Freud, and we'll pick up here, right? We didn't do this one yet. I have that we left off. Okay. So one other big part of Freud's theory, and there's a bunch of different things in his theory, and some that are more relevant to our class than others, but this one is definitely relevant in that he talked about 3 different like forces of the personality. Now, these aren't structures or parts of the brain or anything like that. These are areas of personality that he talked about that we each possess, right? The id, the ego, and the superego. And I think this picture is really helpful for these 3 different structures. I think it kind of like, or like forces, if you will, it kind of sums them up visually. But we all have an id, an ego, and a superego. And according to Freud, this should all be in balance or it causes problems. In our case, maybe struggles that might relate to mental illness. So the id, the one over here on the left, is the part of us that's like dominated by pleasure. Now, Freud was all about things like the libido, which he felt like was kind of our pleasure-filled force that we all have. And so the id is the part of us that's super unconscious. It wants what it wants. It wants it right now. It doesn't follow like the rules, right? It's all about like getting pleasure and satisfying like desire. Not a single one of you is giving into your id right now. You wouldn't be behaving properly if you did. Like I'd be down like eating like 50 donuts or something like that, right? It's like the part of you wants what it wants it right now, doesn't care. If I skip the middle for a minute, the superego is kind of like the angel on your shoulder. If the id is the devil on your shoulder, the superego would be like the angel. It's your conscience. It's your ideal. It has all this like what you should do. Right? And when your superego is too dominant, it might cause problems with anxiety, for example, like guilt or shame or anxiety because you're not doing the things that it feels like you should be doing. And the ego is the part of you in the middle that's kind of like the mediator. It's in touch with reality, right? It kind of compromises between the two constantly. So Freud talked about if these were out of balance, it could cause issues. Right, the id would be too dominant, could lead to like aggression and addiction issues, the superego more like anxiety. And so we hope that we get a balance of like the ego in the middle. So he talked about a lot of other ideas like the psychosexual stages of development. A little bit that came up last time with like the oral, anal, phallic, and all those different stages. But this one probably most relevant to what we're covering in here. In terms of his therapy, I will tell you, this is not the most popular type of therapy anymore. It's definitely fallen out of favor. It was the only type of therapy for a long time. Freud invented therapy, right? The talking treatment or the talking cure, it was called back when he started to kind of coin this idea. But this type of therapy has a lot of little like ideas that we use in different types of therapy, right? Stuff like free association, which we'll talk more about, working through things, transference. These are some kind of like key ideas within this area. Free association is a really interesting one And it's a big part of this type of therapy in the sense that people will sit there and just kind of say whatever is on their mind. So Freud would have people typically lay on a couch. He was the one to start the idea of a couch. And he would sit behind them so that you couldn't see him. But he thought that if you could see them, that it would kind of influence what you had to say. So he'd sit out of sight and have you just share whatever comes into your mind. And this is a very popular technique in this approach. It can also sometimes be used where like he gives you a word and you give him a word back. And we look for themes and trends. But I have a clip that kind of shows what this type of therapy looks like. It is so cheesy and so old, but I love it anyway. I don't know why. You're going to learn how to flirt in this clip really badly, but you'll still learn. But it's a good example of what this type of therapy looks like. This poor guy's not like the brightest. He doesn't quite put things together as quickly as you want to, but I still think it's a good idea, or a good lot of like feeling and history with that word skyfall, right? And so he gets stuck and he can't come up with something really quickly like he did for everything else. And so that would be something meaningful that we would then want to like go explore a little bit more and work through. Right? The idea in this type of therapy is you identify stuff, probably from your childhood, probably from things that happen with your parents, right? Very early kind of things. And then you work through them. You reinterpret them, you talk them over repeatedly, you keep talking about them, keep working through them until they're resolved. This is a very, very long-winded type of therapy. This is part of the reason why it's not so popular anymore, because it's not really supported by most insurance companies, because you're looking at years. Like in an ideal situation, Freud saw his patients or clients 3 to 4 times a week for years, right? And that's not something that most insurance companies are willing to support. So it's not popular, but this idea of free associating and working through is definitely parts of other types of therapy as well. Another really big thing that you see here is something called transference. This is a really interesting one, and I've experienced this on both sides of therapy. I've experienced it as the therapist, in which case we call it countertransference. And I've experienced it as the client, having transference onto my therapist. I've also had people do this to me, and it sometimes is very uncomfortable, but you end up redirecting feelings toward people in your life onto your therapist. And part of the reason why this happens in this approach specifically is because you spend so much time with this person that you start to develop a relationship with them. And so the essence of this is that maybe you're really mad at your partner, or you're really mad at your mom or your dad or whoever, like someone in your life. All of a sudden you start to become mad at your therapist and you take it out, you transfer those feelings onto them. And sometimes they can transfer feelings onto you, right? So like I've been seeing my therapist for almost 5 years now. I have so much transference with her. It's crazy, right? Like I often like see her as like a mother figure, and she often sees me as like a child figure because I'm the same age as her kids. So transference and countertransference from this perspective, it can be really helpful because you can use that information to work through things and bring up themes that happened in your life, but work through them with a safe person who is your therapist. Yeah.
That's why I guess therapist is like a lot of that.
Yeah. Mhm.
That's why I'm not. For those who are like
Yeah.
crazy.
It can be challenging. So I had, like, I will take the anger any day, but I once had a client, it was like a young male client, and he all of a sudden out of nowhere started bringing me gifts. And he was like trying to flirt with me. I'm like, buddy, you are barking up the wrong tree. And like, every possible way. Like, 1, I'm married, 2, to a woman, and 3, like, client, right? Like, no, right? And there were like 5 through 20, but no, like, what with those 3. So this guy, out of nowhere, he starts bringing me candy and like desserts, which like, I mean, that's the way to my heart. That's my love language. Desserts, sure. But it was so awkward. And like, I didn't understand it at first. Like I was trained to be a therapist. So I was like, what's going on? He would stalk me. He left me like 25 messages a day. I mean, just really intense. Like I would rather someone be mad at me out of nowhere than that. Like that was awkward. And eventually, like it came out, like, I don't remember how we got there, but he was in love with his best friend's girlfriend, who was completely unavailable to him because she was in love with his best friend. And so he took someone who was unavailable and transferred those feelings to somebody else who was unavailable And so we were able to kind of work through it once we identified what it was, but it was like a month and a half of really awkwardness before we figured out what was going on, before I figured out what was going on. Yeah.
So,
Often. Yeah, you don't mean to do it, but when you like develop a relationship with somebody, and especially in such a like odd context, therapy is kind of an odd situation in some ways, right? And so you develop these feelings that you kind of put onto your therapist, not so much intentionally, they just kind of come about. And it's often the case because the therapist is a safe person that you take things that aren't safe in your life and you transfer them onto them. If the therapist can identify them, it can give you really good information. But sometimes it takes a bit, like with my client, like it took me a little bit to realize what was happening. Super helpful once we figured it out. But he didn't mean to do it. Like it had nothing to do with me at all. He was just transferring those feelings onto a safer person. Yeah.
So you did stay with the client and work through it?
Yeah.
And so, and it came out to work out positively?
Eventually, yeah.
Okay, but it just took time.
It did take time.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's awesome. And it shows that it's worth it to be patient and understanding and
Yeah.
don't just give up so easily on someone.
Yeah, and that there's often something deeper to it.
Yeah.
Right. And so in the beginning, like I didn't understand. I'm like, how is this? Like, I have given you no reason to think that like I would have any interest. And it was really awkward. But like, you know, we had a lot of conversations about boundaries. We had a lot of conversations about what was appropriate and what wasn't. And then like as he was talking one day, this little theme emerged of like this person that he was in love with, but was like inaccessible to him. And I just like had a little light bulb with it. And then it was like, once we worked through that a little bit, it eased off on the feelings toward me. Like it completely stopped after like we kind of identified it and worked through it a little bit, which I was so thankful. Right. Yeah.
So would it be possible to say that according to Freud, maybe this person was lacking love in early stages and that's
Sure.
why they were transferring these feelings onto you because
Mhm.
maybe just when assume the person the woman said was a girlfriend, so
Yeah.
maybe because they're women, they're like, oh, woman, comfort, like he kind of
Sure.
put it together, like if we're trying to analyze it from Freud's perspective.
Yeah. Oh, so Freudian to be like,
Yeah.
you didn't get your needs met as a child from your parents, right? And so now you have these, like these feelings that you're transferring onto someone else, right? Really Freudian to go at it that way. Yeah. Oh, no, I'll go back, I'll go to your note. Yeah. You know, I don't think so, but I'm not sure. Someone look it up, like, someone look up when Freud's mom died. Wait, that's an interesting Google search, like, when did
I
Freud's
think
mom
he
die?
was.
Yeah, I don't think so, but look it up, someone, if you find it, let me know. Yeah, did you have a thought?
Oh, yeah, and also can I just say that you didn't like your patient, like, because you're unavailable as the authority therapist area, it's like, you know, looking for that.
Sure.
Looking for, you know, you just.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that could be a big part of it too. So, and I'm a very like open book. So like for me, for example, when I was a child, my mom was very like cold, like not very warm, not very like nurturing and loving. My therapist is like very warm. And I often wish like, because we have such a good relationship, she's the same age as my mom. I see her in a very motherly light. So that would be my transference toward her. I'm putting those like wishes and feelings toward my mom onto a safe, like motherly kind of figure. And that's what like the essence of this is. And so it brings up things that you can then work through and identify. My therapist specializes in attachment, so she's very like aware of and familiar with it. And we've used that information therapeutically. And that's kind of the goal here, is if you can identify it, you can use it in a very like helpful way. Yeah.
His mother died in 1930, so he and like.
Okay.
So he started publishing, exactly, and the second to last, work was published in 1930.
Okay.
That's the second to last,
So she was alive.
for the majority of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's not much ever written about his relationship with his parents. But if you go with like the idea that most of these people, their theories are shaped by their lives, it must have been something interesting for him to have all of this related to that. Yeah.
Thing I read in the book that I found super interesting was that when I was reading about the humanistic and existential perspective, they were saying how religion is not as kind of looked down upon in science because you can't prove it, but studies show it does do better for mental health. And Sigmund Freud said religion is for people who can't like face their problems. I think it's interesting because if he has such a hate or like such discomfort with religion, maybe it's part of his trauma or something.
Maybe. Yeah, I love it, right? All the layers to it. I love it. Yeah.
So also too, so transference can, it could possibly lead to him working through it, right? So
Yeah.
it can kind of, if done in the right manner and
Yeah.
that kind of thing, okay,
Oh, yeah. And you can use it as like a vehicle to work
Yeah.
through it. It can also be a barrier.
right,
Right, like if you can't identify it or you can't keep it under control, right? Like, so if my feelings toward my therapist went too far,
okay,
it could break boundaries, make it difficult to work together, and it might be where then you have to refer that person out. So if I hadn't identified that with my client and we hadn't been able to work through it, I probably would have had to refer him out because he was at the point where it was like inappropriate.
but you have evidence. when
Yeah.
that happens too,
Mhm.
in a negative way, I mean, sometimes it happens kind of in a, as long as boundaries aren't crossed and all
Right.
that, correct, okay,
Yeah, and sometimes the boundaries that are crossed are really meaningful.
okay.
Right, and you can use that information
Yeah.
to help you.
Mhm.
Right? A good therapist would like see the whole picture, but sometimes people get caught up in like the little details of what's happening and forget to see the big picture. This approach is all about the big picture, and others aren't always that way. Yeah.
As a licensed therapist, how do you create boundaries like out of the office? Because when you're in the office, you're obviously actively working with your patients.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously your 50-minute time slot, as you mentioned last class. When the 50 minutes are up, how do you create boundaries? Like I still want to help people, but I have a life outside of work. And I
Yeah.
have family. Also, this kind of work is very mentally draining. Like
Very.
you take on people's issues. How did you create those boundaries or learn to over time?
I left therapy to become a teacher. Right. So I mean, to be honest, that's probably the hardest part of therapy. It is draining, right? And again, you have people coming to you often at their worst, where they're really struggling. There's a lot going on. And for me, like I was training to be a therapist, and there was this one telling thing for me. And I think it was really like meaningful when I was counseling, when I was sitting there as a therapist. I would watch the clock and I wanted it to be over, right? I didn't outwardly express that, but inwardly I was always like, okay, 10 more minutes, right? Like 15 more minutes. As a teacher, I'm always watching the clock and wishing I had more time. And so like for me, that was like, oh, one of them, I wish I had more. And the other, like, I'm wishing it's over, right? And I feel like I was really good at being a therapist, but it was draining, right? And it is hard to have boundaries. And I'm not someone who does well with not wanting to go home and tell like my partner about everything. And you really can't do that as a therapist. You can't share all the details of things that came up, and so you do have to create boundaries and you do have to make those boundaries for yourself. And oftentimes therapists go to therapy and they can talk about their clients with other therapists. That's allowed because they're both bound by confidentiality. So that's a big thing that people do to help themselves is they see another therapist and they consult about their clients together and kind of debrief together. And that can be a big one to help with the strain of the things that come up. Yeah.
When you talk about boundaries, let's say, for example, like, I guess it's happening to me, like, the therapist, like, refers to, like, other clients' experience, but does the same, is that allowed?
Yeah.
Like, you can, like, use your other clients as an example, but, like,
You
that's.
can't give away any like information that would identify them. So as long as you kept it really general, like you couldn't give away any like demographic information that might identify them in any way. But you can use like experiences in a broad and like general way. Like with another therapist, you could give them everything. You could tell them all of it. But with like somebody who's not bound by confidentiality, you have to be much more careful. Right? Like, so I could share general things about clients that I had, like I just did, but I couldn't give you their name and like, anything that would help you to identify them, if that makes sense. Because you're bound by confidentiality. You have to keep it like contained. Anything else about Freudian ideas before we move on? Again, a lot of flaws with Freud's ideas, but they have inspired pretty much everything that came after. So it has an important place, even though it's far from perfect. The next model, very different than Freud, right? Freud was all about the unconscious, which you can't see, you can't measure. It's very ambiguous, and not even something we can prove. Versus the behavioral model is all about like what you can see, what you can measure. It's very, very objective. So from the behavioral model, let me write this in here. We're looking at things like your life experiences. And conditioning. Conditioning is a big one within this perspective. What have you learned to do? Right. So this whole perspective is basically based off our life experiences and what has been taught to us in some way. And two different types of conditioning, kind of throwback to intro psych here, which hopefully is not too far away. How many did you everyone take intro psych? Yeah, right. I believe it's like a prereq. Okay, so classical conditioning as a quick review. And operant conditioning, which we'll get to next. Classical conditioning was Pavlov's form of learning. So Ivan Pavlov, who was famous for his experiment with dogs. Right, so with Pavlov's experiment, he found that when he presented a dog with food, they would salivate or like drool. Right? And so he present the dog with food, they would drool. He threw a bell into the mix. What if I ring a bell, present the food, ring a bell, present the food, ring a bell, present the food, over and over and over again? Pretty soon, the dogs would salivate or drool to the bell because they learned there was a connection between the two things. The bell means food is coming, right? And that's a very famous experiment in psychology. So this type of learning is all about learning associations between two things. The bell is associated with the arrival of the food, right? The two things are linked together. It's a very involuntary and automatic type of learning, in the sense that you don't even always know that it's happening, right? Like two things can become connected to each other without any awareness of why, or even maybe awareness that it did happen. We get words here like the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, right? I won't ask you what those are, but like learning to associate things with each other. And it's often like a mental, physical, or emotional change. Now, this is something that we can very much use in therapy. Maybe you have a trigger that you've learned to associate with something traumatic that happened with you, right? And we can then use that trigger and try and condition it away, right? Kind of get rid of it through conditioning. I have a coworker who, when she was younger, got into a car accident. And when the accident happened, the song Eye of the Tiger was playing on the radio. So whenever she hears the song Eye of the Tiger, her palms start sweating and she freaks out and gets scared. It brings up like a trauma response for her, right? Those two things have become associated with each other in a very like involuntary and automatic way. Very, very common with things like PTSD or trauma. People have like a time of day or a smell or a sound that maybe triggers a response for them, and we can maybe condition it away through this type of learning. Very like kind of passive in the sense that it happens oftentimes without us even being aware of it. On the flip side, operant conditioning, this one was made famous more by like B.F. Skinner. And a couple of others, Thorndike and Skinner were like the two big people here. And this one is all about consequences. If I do X, what happens after, right? So if I act out in class, am I punished or rewarded? If I clean the house, am I punished or rewarded? And being punished or reinforced or rewarded for things changes how likely you are to do it again. So this one on the flip side is very like voluntary, right? And it's not automatic, it's more of like a choice. you're choosing to do something or not based on what happens next. Other things we can say here, we get punishers and reinforcers. Right, are like kind of the big terms here. And then what we get are behavioral changes. So from this perspective, we use this a lot with like a target behavior. Okay, so you're acting out at school. What is reinforcing that? Why are you acting out? Are you enjoying the attention that comes from it? Or, are you helping me like maybe punish it to get rid of it? So there's a very different perspective here, but these two types of learning often work together and can very directly shape our behavior. And so we use a lot of behavioral therapy techniques when it comes to counseling. And specifically, what we can do if we can identify like a specific behavior that somebody has a problem with, then we can work on changing it. This is really common with things like phobias or addictions, or maybe like little behaviors that people have learned that they want to get rid of or are inappropriate. And so what we do is we identify something we want to change, and then we create a plan to change it. Okay, so for example, a token economy, I guarantee all of you have done this at some point. If you maybe receive stickers or check marks or circles or points for like behaviors that were good, and then you can trade it in for something that you want. My kids get this in their classes all the time. If they have a good day, they get a little like golden ticket. And when they get a certain number of golden tickets, they can get a prize. That's a token economy. They're really, really commonly used with kids to change a target behavior. Flooding and systematic desensitization. We'll talk a lot about these in the anxiety unit in like a week or two, but both of these are very common techniques for changing phobias or fears. Let's say that somebody has a fear of heights, right? So if you're afraid of heights, we can do something like flooding, where you get a massive exposure to your heights and you have to get over it quickly. Or much more humane systematic desensitization, where we like build up to it in a kind of gradual, slow way. And we'll talk about this a lot more, as I said, when we get to fears and phobias. But what we do in a behavioral perspective is we identify a behavior, and then we try to change it through the rewards or punishments that are associated with it, or learning to associate it with something else, right? We use all of these techniques to identify and change behaviors. Yeah. So flooding is more like the traditional exposure therapy, but this can be, it's just a much more gradual way of doing it. So in exposure therapy, we take something that you are afraid of and we expose you to it, right? So let's say you're afraid of heights. Flooding would mean that we go to the top of the tallest building we can find, and you cry and you swear and you're unhappy and you feel like you're gonna die, but we work through it. Systematic desensitization, the exposure would be like one story, then two, then three, and four, but they're both, kind of types of exposure therapy. That's used a lot from this perspective. Any other thoughts or comments or questions here? Anything else about the behavioral ones? The next model is the cognitive model. So this one, we're looking at like expectations, thinking patterns, right? Those are kind of the big things here. We're looking at your thoughts, your cognitions, right? And from this model, we look at the assumptions you're making, the false beliefs that you might have. And then we use therapy to kind of challenge those beliefs. Really common with a lot of disorders, that we take, what are the thoughts that you have? What are your automatic thoughts that pop into your head? And it was so interesting. Took my daughter, I think I shared this a week or two ago. I took my daughter, my 12-year-old, to therapy for the first time. And when the therapist asked her, like, why are you here? And they were kind of talking about all of this. And she said something, and my daughter was like, I didn't even mean to say it. But from a therapist perspective, everything you say is meaningful, right? And so my daughter said, like, my friend left me for someone better. That would be her illogical thought or assumption. And the therapist spent the entire rest of the session like dissecting that. My daughter was like, I didn't mean it. I just said it. Well, from this perspective, everything you say is meaningful. So let's take that thought and like work through it and look at it closer. That's a big part of this type of therapy. Really common, this is probably the most common perspective right now, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy combines cognitive therapy and behavioral therapy together, right? And so we look at your thoughts and your behaviors together. It's a very like contemporary model, probably the most popular at the moment. Really big tenet of this model is something called mindfulness. Mindfulness, where you're being in the present moment. You're working on your thoughts and your behaviors together. Great example of how you could combine models together to kind of achieve a little bit more. So cognitive model, again, sometimes combined with the behavioral model, they work really, really well together. Any, sorry, before I move on, any other thoughts or comments, anything with the behavior, cognitive or behavioral model at all? Yeah. DBT? Yeah, dialectical behavioral therapy. Right, and we'll talk about that when we get to a couple of the disorders that's really popular with it. But the idea with that one is challenging beliefs through a very specific framework, where you, the acronym is like Dear Man. You look at the description and the explanation and what are you attributing to it. It's a very like specific framework, but it uses a lot of CBT techniques. So very common for like bipolar disorder and also borderline personality disorder and a couple of others. We'll cover that one later, but yeah, that's a very popular one too. DBT, CBT, we got acronyms for everything, right? Anything else for the moment? Anything now? Okay, let me erase this real quick. The next one, humanistic and existentialist model. It's with this one, I'm gonna write like meaning. What is the meaning in your life? What drives you? We looked a lot at as well, and I'm gonna put like goals. A lot of spirituality in this one. So what things give you meaning in life or purpose? We look at like higher belief systems. This one is a very like positive kind of out there kind of approach in a way. And it was created in response to some of the more pessimistic ones like Freud and so on, which are kind of negative in nature, looking at like aggression and things like that. This one looks more at like meaning in life, what drives you, and a couple of different ones here. We have client-centered and Gestalt-centered. And these are really core types of therapy that we tend to offer. Client-centered was developed by a man named Carl Rogers. And I have a video of Rogers describing his therapy, so I want to play that for you. We don't have a lot of videos of many of these people. And so this is Rogers talking about how he approaches therapy. So I'll play that for you first. And then there was a really cool series made where Rogers and then the next guy, Fritz Perls, work with this woman named Gloria, and they kind of showcase what these therapies look like. Really unique opportunity. But first, let me play this little clip of him. Different, right? Like, so he looks at every little nonverbal thing that she says. They don't really get to anything deep, but it kind of feels like they get somewhere, right? Like in that 4 minutes, I feel like they get farther than her and Rogers did. Yeah.
Is that kind of therapy like still allowed back?
Yes. Yeah, it is, right? And so again, we don't typically tend to do a lot of them purely on their own, but looking at nonverbals like that is really like important, right? And so like, I know for me, like when I'm nervous, I tend to like almost like put my arms around myself like this, right? And so like whenever I do this in therapy, my therapist will be like, what, I noticed you just went like this, like what came up, right? And so looking at nonverbals is really important. But the like skillfully manipulating and frustrating has kind of fallen out of favor. Some people like that direct antagonistic approach, and other people like, you know, don't. And then there's obviously a million things in the middle. So if you had to pick one, forced choice, you have to either go see Rogers for 30 minutes or Pearls for 30 minutes, right? How many of you would pick Rogers by showing him? He's looking better now, right? You're like, oh, that's more than earlier. How many of you would pick pearls? Right? Oh, you want the frustration. I like it. So, I mean, it's just, there's so many different takes on how we do therapy, right? And so what we see here is like the Gestalt therapy. It's very like direct. We're looking for the whole, the form, the pattern. We're gonna frustrate you. We're gonna look at the surface versus over here. And these fall in the same group, right? Versus the ones over here are much more like calm and like, we get there very slowly and you're the one leading it. Right, so, and there's one more here, the existential therapy also falls within this realm. Really interesting with this one. We look at like your meaning in life, very common exercises to do something like, write your obituary. Right, if you were to die today, what's in it and what isn't in it? And let's look at that. Yeah.
Viktor Frankl's like logo there.
Yeah. So Frankl is like a very big person in existential therapy for sure, right? And he was the one who really came up with that like obituary exercise. Very common. Also, things in these, you do a lot of like empty chair techniques where you'll sit in a chair and you maybe talk to an empty chair and imagine someone's in it, right? And then you might even get up and go sit in that chair and take their perspective and then sit in the other chair, like a lot of exercises within that category. But yeah, very common for that one to do things like that with Frankl and so on. So all of these are considered like within one realm, but just the differences between them. I wanted you to see how different these different approaches can be. So we've looked at a couple of videos of it. And again, most of the time we blend them together. So what we'll do next time, since we're out of time, we'll keep going. We have one more model, and then I have a little like activity that we'll do to kind of bring them together. And then we'll move on to chapter 3. We're getting closer to the disorders. They're coming. We're one more chapter to go, right? So I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you all on Monday. What's this? Hey, yeah, what's up?